Thank you very much, everybody. So this is the, if you think this is the flight to Newark, you're wrong. This is the 3:30 session, Fake News and the Cloud. And here's a term, fake news, that we didn't even know existed 4 or 5 years ago, and now has become part of the lingua franca of our spoken English. And we have an extraordinarily appropriate speaker to address us on this topic. Quentin Hardy is the head of editorial at Google Cloud. Quentin writes about the ways that cloud computing technology, and by extension the advent of computer intelligence at every point on the planet, is reshaping society. This builds on a career that has included stops as deputy technology editor at the New York Times, where for many years he wrote about enterprise computing, national editor at Forbes, and a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, covering global business from San Francisco and Tokyo. He frequently appears on television, and for 10 years was part of Forbes on Fox, a weekend news program on Fox News. He also moderates panels at the World Affairs Council and the Computer History Museum. One of his more well-known panel discussions, Programming the System of the World, the Industrial Internet of Things, covered advances in new technologies and how they will change the world. As a reporter, he has written about many diverse topics. His Forbes cover story about technology in Africa, titled Hope and Profit in Africa, received an Overseas Press Club Award. He has interviewed a wide array of political and business leaders, including Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, HP's Carly Fiorina, Google's Eric Schmidt, and Steve Forbes. A Silicon Valley insider with vast global experience, he is sought after for his fresh, clever, and opinionated views. I can attest to those adjectives, which have earned him a loyal following on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media outlets. He is known for offering real-world practicality and insights that audience members can use in their work and lives. Today, Quentin will present a talk entitled Fake News in the Cloud. Please take a moment to silence all your electronic devices, but don't put them away. We hope to see you tweeting to the hashtag Dawn or Doom. It is my great pleasure to introduce Quentin Hardy.
Thank you very much. What the hell you mean this isn't the flight to Newark? That was fake news. All right, well, thank you very much for coming this afternoon. And that's so great what you said about don't silence your phone, actually, because one time I saw Jaron Lanier, this virtual reality thinker, speak, and he said at the beginning something that I thought was so valuable. It doesn't really pertain to my talk, but it's worth bearing in mind. He said at the very start, I'd like you to listen to what I say and then tweet. I want it to pass through you. I don't want you to just be a vehicle that bounces back what I'm going to say to build up your Twitter following. I want you to sort of spend some time, have it spend time inside yourself and then tweet it if you want to. And I thought he was making a very important distinction about the urgency we all feel and the potential loss of our personal humanity that comes at a peril, the peril you feel of just being inside a system and not steering the system. And in fact, some of my talk today will touch on these impulses and how they have converged to give us this environment of fake news. First, you just heard way too much of my biography. You're about to get a little bit more, but in a different inflection. I am a journalist. I am third generation as a journalist. Both of my grandparents, my grandfather on my father's side owned a newspaper in Iowa, which failed in 18 months, sort of web speed, right? And then my mother's father was the AP congressional correspondent. He grew up in Petersburg, about 30 miles south of here, and I always try to visit when I go back. My father was in direct marketing. He's in the Direct Marketing Hall of Fame because he developed Time Life Books, which was an amazing mail-order success. And then he was the publisher of Life magazine. My mother did newsletters and special interest stuff, so she was sort of like a vertical reporter in her own way. I was, as you heard in the Wall Street Journal, in Japan, in the Valley. I've been on Forbes. I spent 10 years on Fox. We can talk a little bit about my experience doing that kind of TV, which is pretty interesting stuff. And, of course, at the New York Times. Now I'm at Google doing what I hope is similar analytic work around cloud computing from that venue. Let me begin by just sort of trying to define the cloud a little bit, since it is such an amorphous term. It can be a very specific kind of technological definition having to do with software and hardware structures. But for the larger purposes that I'm interested in, it's kind of a proxy for the technology of really a new basic civilization that we are in the process of creating, having to do with an enormous number of sensors into a communication with each other and with enormous data centers on a global basis, enormous databases, evaluating and weighing this information that's being created, it traveling around at a tremendous velocity, people involved in social networks and social media connecting with each other in small and large groups on a local and a global basis, and all of this information being analyzed and computed at just an unbelievable large scale for extremely small amounts of money, considering the amount of relative to the computational cost that had come in the past. Got all that? Good. Set that aside, because yeah, everything is moving at a very high velocity. That's not news. What we do need to think about is how is this technology entering the world, and how did it come to give birth to so much so-called fake news? And I think in some ways it fits into a very familiar pattern where, timeout. Jerry, I do not have a clock, and I wanted to allow time for Q&A, so
I'll flag you at 15 minutes.
Flag me when I have 15 minutes. If anybody has questions before that that are burning, raise your hands and I'll break off and we'll have more of a dialogue. Thank you. I think it's important to remember that whenever the future shows up, it consists 95% plus of the past, right? It isn't created out of the whole cloth. It is a subject to various vectors into which a technology establishes itself. I think the most interesting example in history is the coincidence by which the printing press happened around the same time that Constantinople fell, and an enormous number of new texts flooded into Western Europe, and people wanted to consume these, and they wanted to read them in their native languages because there was an emerging bourgeoisie that didn't have the time and the leisure to learn ancient Greek and Latin, or Arabic, into which many of them had been translated. So it gave to this boom in vernacular culture. And then hot on that, the discovery of the New World created all this information that people wanted to consume at a new level. So the printing press found this ready market, both in new ideas and in translated information. That, 20 or 30 years later, gave rise to the first best-selling author in history, a guy named Martin Luther, who translated the Bible and led the Protestant Reformation. So if you think, you know, sort of fun to think where we're going now and what might be happening a couple decades hence because of the new technology and the vectors that it will come subject to. History tends to be written in the rearview mirror. It's hard to say what the vectors are, but I do want to talk today about some of the vectors that I think did contribute to the dilemma of fake news. I'll talk about some of the causes, then some of the effects, including various business and political causes and distortions, and then suggest a few possible outcomes, possible solutions, and possible new vectors that we can consciously create to develop a more healthy information environment. Okay, so as I say, you know, all technology comes into its own in a context of its time. And one of the interesting things about the internet is that it comes in the late 20th century just as the culture is facing a certain kind of difficulty or crisis around certainty. if you were here for the panel earlier today, we were talking about C.P. Snow, who in the late 1950s talked about the emerging two cultures, that there were these technocratic societies with highly specialized learning, and the people inside them were so far inside their specialty, they were steering society by dictating how we would live, what would keep us healthy, what machines of war were being created, but they were so far in, they couldn't speak well with the broader group of humanity, or for that matter, people inside the humanities who were at a loss to figure out the role of man in all this, that the function of the humanities, which was to explain human beings to themselves, was being lost in this scientific revolution. And he didn't mention this, but I think he was putting his finger on something very real, which has continued in some ways, but also led to a kind of social distrust of experts or eggheads. It was latent in what Snow was saying, but it's become even more so and become a kind of fodder for common political discourse. And the other element of that in the two cultures was the arts. And while Snow didn't talk about this, there was a crisis of certainty and rationality going on throughout much of the 20th century. You could see it in things like Ludwig Wittgenstein's theories of knowledge and language and the impossibility of fully knowing or expressing anything. Or for that matter, in physics, Heisenberg's ideas about observations at a small scale, and you couldn't say what was a wave or a particle at the same time, and that so-called uncertainty principle being abstracted into a larger sensibility about the inability to ever know certain what's going on in the world. Or Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which was, mathematically true around the inability of any system to be fully complete, but like Heisenberg or like Wittgenstein, was abstracted into the humanities general as a dilemma about knowing anything for certain, which in a way feathers into other post-war humanities efforts to quite rightly identify hidden voices in society. So you get gender studies, and you get post-colonial studies, and you get sexuality-based studies, and in short, everyone is given their own form of truth, and the canon of truth that had held humanity supposedly at a high level together for however many centuries you want to pick, was fraying apart into many, many kinds of truth. So there is this latent willingness in society to accept this, and suddenly you've got this interesting tool, the internet, where it's almost as if we built something that fulfilled that idea of incomplete knowledge and point of view-based knowledge, because you're forever building your own system of knowledge out of these links, and there are all these other links you're never going to be able to see or accept, and your coherence is your own. And you see this in search engines all the time, where your search results are based on your previous experiences and your previous searches, so that someone like me in California can put in some words in a Google or a Bing, and he'll get a different page of results from someone in Indiana with different interests and passions putting in the same words. They will link you to different things. It's almost like we built a machine that validates the incompleteness and situational nature of our knowledge. And so that, and yet also the almost putting to rest objectively a 2,500-year project in Western thought to know everything. That Aristotle said, our thought has a teleology, it has an endpoint. And in your life, you will not know the final cause, you will not know everything. But someday, we are aiming towards a state where we will know everything, and we will seek continuous awareness among each other, this harmony, and the internet just blows that apart because the pages are always going to be edited and munged, and it's very much like a Gödel system. It can't be complete in itself. It's going to change. So we get this machine that kind of validated all that. Okay, That's the intellectual vector. The other vector is much more down to earth. It's the business vector. And the internet comes into its own in a certain post-war heyday of targeted marketing and sales. The ability to sell with increasing granularity, to spot people and give them what they need according to their presumed social class, their presumed status, their presumed wealth, and market particular products to them. I mentioned earlier my father is in the Direct Mail Hall of Fame. I grew up on this stuff. You know, we would have, this is how junk mail used to work. You would, you know, write 5 or 6 different letters and send them to different zip codes where people of this income strata tended to live, and you would test out which one worked best, and then you'd send more of those letters to similar zip codes and vend that thing to that person, and so on and so forth. Well, that was a good way to offer a lot of consumer choice and a good way to give the people what they want and sell a lot of stuff. But it is also a certain ultimately qualitative change in the way we live, where it becomes increasingly more difficult in our consumption and our daily lives to meet people who aren't like ourselves. We find we live in gated communities. We have a kind of, along with our racial segregation, we have a kind of social segregation that is implicit. We have gerrymandered voting, so that the politician in your district who thinks like you is going to get in much more easily. We have an explosion of cable news and interest groups, so that, you know, if you are interested in this kind of subject or you see this kind of thing, it's speaking to you. And it's this wonderful explosion of information to all points and a wonderful sort of up-close pleasure at having ourselves affirmed, but it also comes at a certain cost of not consuming the same sorts of things commercially or intellectually, or informationally for that point. I mean, on a gross level, I could call this, imagine 3 bags of groceries, one from Whole Foods, one from Safeway, one from Walmart. You could open them up and see 3 different worlds, 3 different prices, the values that go into 3 different types of consumption, and times that to every way we live now. So there had been this post-war kind of consumer comfort, but also a certain loss of consensus and a certain loss of common life and expectations, so that it becomes increasingly difficult to meet people who aren't kind of like yourself and to encounter difference, which I think you can see where I'm going to go where fake news applies, because part of the purpose of fake news is you'd only believe it if you kind of believed it in the first place. You know, it plays to your bias. You know, if I read that the Queen of England is dealing drugs, I tend not to think it. But there are other people who, for various reasons, may find that an affirmation. I probably have my own total bullshit stories that I would nod my head at and go, okay, yeah, sure. You know, that's true. And you just don't reality check them the way you used to. So that it is also possible, from a business point of view, to pick up the last business vector, to find and create common interest groups in a level there never were before. I mentioned cable news. That creates a kind of group identity across geographies, so that somebody like Fox News, which has the most loyal and the most successful viewership, actually has only about 5 million viewers. It isn't that big, but it concentrates very well, and it echoes very well, and it calls to action its viewers very well, so it feels like a really big part of the country and has this amplified impact on people. Let me pick up the third vector, which is the nature of the news business itself. So news is really kind of a weird and interesting product when you think about it. What is news? I mean, it's this information business passing along what's new, or what's interesting, or how your world is changing. And sometimes we read it because it helps make us money. Sometimes we read it because it helps us avoid danger. Mostly we read it because by nature we're curious beings and we hunger to learn more about the world we inhabit. And It's a weird form of entertainment we like, that, finding out what's happening and sort of broadening our horizons, even if it's just like what happened at the local school board last week. But fundamentally, successful news organizations were like three-legged stools. They had immediacy, which might be News Week, or Business Week. That's kind of dying away. Or daily newspapers. They had authority. This is a trusted source for most things. Or they had the ability to contextualize. Something weird happens, and there is a raft of experts or people who are inside the system who can tell you how this place is in the world. Something strange has happened. How am I supposed to think about that? And they also, those are the three things they really have at core. How they control information or how they manage information was a very interesting thing. And I'm not sure it was intentional, but it came to be that they were the gatekeepers of information over the axis of time and space. They controlled the time and space of information for a very large amount of information. Breaking stuff. Books take a long time to publish. Radio is its own thing. We can get into that if you want. But a newspaper, print, for, say, the Indianapolis Star, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the New York Times, before it developed ambitions to be a national newspaper, controlled that area of information. There might be another paper, but the two of them would fight it over. That was the information for Indianapolis. And it was a daily paper, the Indianapolis Daily Star, I suppose it was called. And, so every 24 hours, there was this cadence of information. Sometimes there'd be extra editions, but they'd be based on the super story of that day, into which they'd feather other stuff, and then they'd remake it. And this turned out to be incredibly valuable. Up until even 10 years ago, I think, maybe 15 now, the average newspaper had twice the profit margin of the average Fortune 500 company. Like, once you got to scale, man, it was fantastic. And that was because you were the information gatekeeper for time and space. Say you own a department store in Indianapolis or an auto dealership, something like that. You're going to have a sale on Saturday? It's got to be in that paper on Wednesday, because, like, that's the time and the space. The people in Indianapolis need to know a couple days ahead of time that on Saturday they should go downtown and buy your sofa, and that's how you're going to do it. So these guys have this incredible lock on time and space. And then this internet thing shows up, and it blows apart time and space. And that's really bad news for their business model, right? Because the time and space don't matter. It's like the eternal now and it's the eternal here. Information can flow from everywhere. I don't know if, for those of you who saw the panel this morning, Dave was bemoaning the fact that he writes for this local paper, and this kid is telling him about this story that he wrote, but it's on the phone, and the kid isn't reading it on the paper anymore. He's just getting it over the internet, through his app or whatever, passed along through Reddit or Twitter. And he has no sense of its origin. So Dave isn't really making very much money or affirming his brand very well by the fact that it's now on the internet. But there's an enormous resistance to change. It's a deep psychological thing. And I see this again and again in technology. Again, the future consists mostly of the past. Incumbent businesses try to transfer themselves with a minimal amount of the trauma of change into new environments. And that can be difficult, shall we say. And so the news businesses, of course, if you look at the early internet pages, they look like TV screens or they look like magazine pages. They think they'll just port this over the internet and they'll put ads on that, and people will advertise the same way they used to. Fat chance, First thing that happens is the news gets disaggregated. And as Clay Shirky said, in a somewhat negative moment, and then the newspapers found out what all those stories they wrote were worth once they were detached from the comics pages. That was mean. We had school lunch menus too, but there's a fair point there. People were buying them for many reasons, and the stories themselves turned out to have a somewhat questionable value. But there's something deeper going on, having to do with the way in which this new technology can measure very precisely who and what is doing the reading, or how long things are being read, or what's being passed along. As a bunch of news executives said at Google, using a slightly saltier word, why do you want to mess with the magic? You know, why do you want to make this accountable? Why, you know, we're making such incredible profit margins by people not knowing where their ad dollars are going. Why would you suddenly want to know whether or not somebody read the ad, or whether this story was actually interesting to somebody so they read the whole thing? Well, over at Google, I guess they didn't understand that line of argument very well, because they were like, we got a new business model here, and you print paper, we send bits, it's a lot cheaper. We have scale, you know, and that scale thing was just no joke at all. When my dad was sending direct mail in those days, you were profitable if you got like a 3% response rate. Home run at 5. The reason he's in the Direct Marketing Hall of Fame is he got 7 on Time Life books, 7%. But if you're like, and you know, and I said they would send letters to zip codes and like try and figure out, you know, this group of 10,000 people, generally they're like richer, and you know, Nevada City, in Tahoe City, over the other side of the California-Nevada border, you know, still part of Tahoe, but on the Nevada side, where there are sharply lower income taxes, that was like one of the most published phone books per capita in America, because every stock brokerage had a copy of it. You just call up everybody in Nevada City because they were probably rich. You know, they were probably some California tax cheat in their summer home. So, but that's actually a pretty blunt instrument when you think about it, right? Google can say, wow, well, based on their search interest, you know, search history, this is someone who likes canoeing in New Hampshire, you know, this June. It's like super targeted. This is fantastic. And because of that, oh, and, you know, my dad had to put a stamp on every envelope, not personally, but like, you know, that's really expensive actually. And Google's sending this stuff for free, right? Or near free. So this is fantastic. This is an amazing business, and your response rates can be in like the 1/100ths of 1%, because you're counting things in the millions. You know, you're counting 1 billion and 1 billion more searches every day. It's just incredible with the velocity. I mean, raise your hand if you've clicked on a search ad. That's pretty good. I get probably 1/4 of the room. You know, I never have, and yet these guys have this enormous pile of money, right? You know, and like, did you actually buy something? Or, you know, Google collected maybe 2 cents from you that one time in your life. Nonetheless, you know, it aggregates really, really well. So this kind of measurement and scale is something the news businesses are not ready for, and they scramble, right? They got this ad model where they thought they'd put this ad in the paper and it would have this cost, it would sort of be associated. Now the ads are directly associated with a single story, and it better get a lot of clicks. Like, we can start to measure the life of individual stories in a way we never had before. And I don't want to suggest that the news business had always been super objective and oracular, you know, and wasn't subject to social whims and mores of the time, because there were a lot of stories people used to write in the old news business because there was an advertising demand, or because there was a, well, you know, gossip columns and celebrity news has always been with us. And like, the news value of that is somewhat questionable, but people like to read it and they wrote it. Or more to the point, I don't think most newspaper people were really that beguiled with automobiles, but they wrote automotive sections every quarter because there were auto advertisers who would take out a lot of space in that section, you know? So that was like, there was a bias to serving the advertiser anyway. But this time, man, every story like has click dimensions. And this can be quite sobering when you're writing really important stuff from, say, Africa. I've seen the numbers inside the Times, and very, very important stories versus very slight stuff. I don't think the Times is making money on their Africa reporter, and God bless them, they're investing in things because they think they're important. It also helps their overall brand to be the newspaper that is reporting from these places, and even if you don't read the story, you're happy reading a paper that has that stuff, so there's associated values. The Times is kind of a special organ where that's concerned. But, you know, certainly accountability and click-through take on this new meaning in the newsroom. Click-through itself takes on meaning inside news. What's going to get a lot of clicks? You know, that's a feedback loop we'll pay attention to, okay? And so in some of the new businesses, there is this shocking moment for young journalists where there's like a counter up in the room that's telling them how many clicks their story's getting every day and a quota around what they need to do next, which it's hard to see can do anything to help you get some depth and context and nuance, because you got to get like, go get those clicks, man. You know, and once you're an authority in a subject, somehow, maybe you can speak on that, but you tend to start to move towards certain subjects that you know will raise a lot of clicks. Certainly our current president gets a ton of attention, partly because he's the president of the United States, partly because you just can't stop reading this stuff. And, you know, it's thrilling for a news organization how much his tweets can create in terms of clicks on normal news businesses. And they're not going to stop, you know, punching at that stuff because, man, it's amazing. Or, for that matter, certain consumer tech products, Apple, you know, will release a phone and the world goes nuts because people click on Apple stories. Like, is the latest Apple's phone really that big a news item? Questionable. Is it going to get a ton of clicks? You bet. You know, and that plays into a certain larger hero story. But the news judgment shifts as click-throughs become an immediate means of evaluating what quality is. It just becomes overt in terms of listicles, news sites that just do celebrity stuff, most of it disingenuous, or, you know, has headlines like, "You won't believe what happened next," which forces you to click, you know, or, you know, "Number 3 will blow your mind," you know, "Cat's doing heroic things," right? "Number 4 will drive you nuts," you know. Okay, I'll go to 4. You got me, you know. I'm subject to it too. And also the news business of just finding viral videos, because we have, referring back to the environment of full information, because we have people recording so much more of daily life than we ever had before, there's just all this incredible free material. So you can have a news business, it's like wild things somebody recorded, a skateboard act, somebody escaping a burning building, what have you, that you can appropriate and get clicks that way. So this urgency, this need to, you know, keep going, this kind of almost anxiety around, you know, clicking the next thing gets built into the system. It turns into this flywheel of like, they're clicking, keep doing it, they're clicking, keep doing it, until there is exhaustion, you know, and it's very hard to predict. I mean, who would have ever guessed the dress? Remember the dress? Is it blue? Is it gold? Is it blue? Like, who cared? But oh my God, it was huge, you know? And then you're all just like, it's like binging on a box of chocolates at the end, right? You're like, oh, what did I do? You know? And then, of course, layer onto that the advent of social media, where your friends are passing things, or you're passing things to your friends and creating a kind of fame or authority. And this plays into something very deep inside us that is good and profound, but in this case, kind of distorted, which is the general circles of how we trust the world. This is something psychologists will talk about. We tend to trust our own experience foremost. What has happened to me before? What is this like? After that, we tend to trust our friends because we have shared emotional bonds, experiences, history. Then we tend to trust the news businesses. This is a few years ago, but I think it's probably still true, at least, reputational news businesses with whom we have historic trust. Then we trust, like, there's this outer zone of politicians and corporations that we don't like to trust very much, even if we're consuming or subject to them, whatever. And so social media gets you really deep inside that ring of trust. And, if your friend sends it to you, you're really much more likely to click on it because it's playing on your trust. Like, they liked it, I'll probably like it too. I'm affirming my friendship. That's great. So news organizations have social media editors who want to try and move things through, and want to leverage this ability to keep doing this. So that's where those are sort of the dimensions of what this is able to do, and does call on a business with a lot more urgency that's likely to get immediate clicks and responses and plays to a world where there is just much more information. It contributes to it and it is subject to it at the same time. Now, the readership, of course, raise your hand if you don't think you're getting enough information in your day right now. Yeah, I thought so, right? It's like, I get these students at Cal. I'll ask you, I ask them questions every year when I start the class. I'll ask you this one. If a village in Peru were to disappear in a mudslide and 1,000 people died, and you didn't hear about it for 5 days, if it didn't make the internet in 5 days, would you think that was weird? Would that seem strange to you that it took that long for the information to get? Hey, a lot of you are nodding. That would really seem weird, right? Well, if you think about it, that's really like, it's bad for the imaginary people in Peru, but it's kind of freaky for us too, because I recently had occasion to see an item at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, which was this note that the British exploring bureaucracy used to give people if they were going to die. Leave this, with your last latitude and longitude of where you were and what you were doing. And in 5 different languages, which were the chief languages of exploration at the time, it says, like, please return this to the nearest British consul. And this was a note that had been written and left on, like, Baffin Island in 1842. And it was found in 1854, 12 years later. Like, that was sort of, if you heard of anything, you heard of it a long time later outside of your kind of immediate circle. That's sort of the normal way for centuries people received information. And obviously that has been accelerating for some time, but it is at a qualitatively different state over the last 20 years. You're just inundated with all of this information all the time, often disastrous because by our nature we feed on anxiety a little bit. That's meaningful information to us because it tells us we have to react. It's sort of a hardwired thing. If you're in the veldt, knowing there's a lion over there, that's a big deal. Knowing that tree is really pretty, kind of a lesser order thing, right? Sir, this morning you mentioned how hard you think the world is. That's because the world is pushing a lot of really bad info at you and you lose context, right? That's, I'm not picking you, well, I am picking you out, but everybody else in the room's got the same problem. I do too. It's like there's just an immense amount of freaky news coming at us all the time, and that's a kind of anxiety. So this is what the new information in its early days has kind of rendered. It has taken the good and the bad of the previous information system and kind of stretched and distorted it, and it's created this level of urgency around how we're consuming information and how we feel at the end of the day. So, how does fake news rise up and start playing into this? Well, I think we can probably see a number of things right off the bat. Is it sensational? Going to get clicks. Is it geared for your friends to pass around because you're not going to believe this? Yeah, probably. Is it and this is a very important part of fake news, is it playing to your pre-existing bias? Is it along the lines of what you probably thought in the first place? You're going to read it. Because in all that information, you're not going to have to change your mind. You're not going to have to think, oh, maybe that other thing was right. Maybe that's stressful thinking the other thing was right. It's going to affirm what I thought about Hillary or Trump or taxes or this or that. You know, it's like there, you're right. You know, it's like, it's okay. The way you see the world is a correct way to see the world. And cable news did this, and talk radio did this to some extent. It like found that niche market, that gated community, if you will, that club that magazines used to sort of own, or newsletters would find, and it helps them affirm themselves with falsified information. And the people doing this often are laughing. You know, like guys in Budapest were writing some of this stuff last year and just launching it out there and making a ton of money because it got clicked on while it was being passed around here. You know, people thinking it was totally serious. But you can see what the business function was like. You can get a lot of clicks. It's really sensational. Some people laugh at it. Some people pass it along. And some people see it as a form of affirmation in a kind of information-drenched society. So it gives them this, ability to bond with each other and feel that their point of view is shared and that their group actually understands the world. And this capability has been used in sort of positive ways where political organizations rise up and do good for, say, disaster relief. It has been used in questionable ways, like birtherism or anti-vax or 9/11 was an inside job. We can all debate that if you want, but it provides this kind of salve. I think this is a part of fake news that people don't really recognize, and I think it's a part of fake news that really shocked people inside the tech world in the past year or so. You know, did Facebook know specifically about the Russian campaign? I don't think so. Did Facebook know a lot of weird news was flying around their pages and getting shared? Well, they are good at counting and measuring stuff, so I think they probably did. But I think, we were speaking in the earlier session about the kind of intellectual biases of the elites who are building this technology. It wasn't their world. They didn't recognize that this stuff would be taken as seriously as it was, because to them it's just like, what? Can you believe anybody believes this stuff? Not only did they believe this stuff, it like helped, it affirmed their worldview. This was the clique and the club, thrive on sensationalized information. They want this stuff. And they feel good in some ways because we have a world with way too much information, and they don't want to be stressed, and they don't want to have to think about the difficult stuff all the time. There's just too much news, right? So this fake news actually fulfills this strange little psychological need as well. Okay. What's the effect? We now suspect in any debate, we suspect the other side of using falsified or biased information. We have leveraged that precursor 20th century idea about situational truth into this accusation of falsifying your truth. Your truth is not the same as my truth. We've taken it in a bad place. We haven't seen it as a shared partial truth. We've turned it into a kind of evil intention or lunacy on your part to believe your, and I'll use air quotes, right, facts. And we look at each other with a kind of mutual incomprehension in this cataract of urgency into which fake news can quite easily reside and make small fortunes for immoral people who make it up and feed on our shared weaknesses, our shared problems, our shared need for a way forward. So fake news affirms, it earns a lot of clicks, it's social, it's next to no cost to produce because you don't have to worry about like actually calling somebody on the phone and getting a fact, you know. This is fantastic stuff, by the way, in terms of cost benefit. But, pardon me? Oh, sorry. And as we have more recently seen, nowadays, it doesn't even have to make a profit. It's an agent of propaganda. I mean, make no mistake. The Russians are winning a war against democracy in what they're doing. This is a very serious thing. You know, it's not just the US election. It's the Catalonian separatists. It's the French right. It's Duterte in the Philippines. These guys are doing this work in a lot of different elections. And I don't even think the motivation is necessarily to put a certain group in power. I think the motivation is to essentially discredit democracy and make people cynical. And that is a very profound worry, because if people become cynical about democracy, people will seek authoritarianism. And that's where Putin comes from, and he wants to deal on that level in the world. So how do we combat that? Like, how can we say no? How can we be better than fake news? Well, I think we need a new kind of literacy. I think in which attribution and the means by which you come to know something are inherent inside the system of knowledge. So that, well, tomorrow actually at 1:15, I saw Don Goldwasser is going to talk about algorithms and how to give a better sense of where something came from. But I was thinking, what if the various systems of authority could put a rider on a story you received, fake or otherwise, that said, we have reason to think this story is bogus. Here's why. It first appears in Budapest at 4 a.m., and at 4:01, it's on 300 Twitter bots. That's not how information normally flows. Fake individuals, invisible, made-up people are pumping this thing up. If you look at the system of distribution, this is like fake news. Do not be fooled. And for starts, that would be a very low-status thing to start passing around to your friends, right? So it would fight that social leverage that fake news gets right now. The next, and I'll credit the dean saying he's having trouble teaching the humanities, or Purdue students don't understand why to teach the humanities. Humanities are entirely about expression, editing, attribution, annotation, clear speech, clear thought. We could add this kind of area to that. I would love for you engineers to figure out systems that could do this. I think it would be incredibly valuable for the democracy. And in addition, I think it would be very valuable to figure out a way in which encountering the other point of view was increasingly positive, increasingly pleasant. I know that some organizations now do actually start saying, here's the way the other side interpreted this story. So you're starting to get that sensibility coming in. I do think we have to fight the tendency that's been going on for 50 years to put ourselves in little different communities and look at each other with mutual incomprehension and find a way to get back to the kind of frontier in which a democracy takes place, where you acknowledge you're different and you acknowledge you have to get along. That's what I have to say. I'd be welcome any questions now. Thank you very much. I can talk about Google or the New York Times, too, if you'd like. I'm a utility player on this.
Hi.
How you doing?
So what do you think about like dispelling sites like Snopes?
I love Snopes.
are they? How are they credible? Like how do they get their information correct?
They raise the question, is this true? And then they address it and look for any kind of evidence or validation, and actually do annotate the fact or the non-fact. And frequently will say, here's how this got made up. Here's what this rose out of. And I think they're on a Kickstarter right now, so it's not the greatest business model. I think they're making money on their Kickstarter, but it's been a chancy but extremely valuable kind of asset to the overall news system. Yeah.
I got a quick one here.
Go.
So there was a browser plugin called AdBlock Plus.
Yeah.
It blocked ads for a while. Then it was purchased by an advertising company, and then it became an ad platform.
I can see why you're depressed.
Right. PolitiFact, Snopes, those are kind of like ad blockers. They're like check,
Right.
They do the service for you.
Right.
What's to stop Snopes or PolitiFact from becoming the gatekeeper and then sort of a propagation of false information rather than a checker? Maybe if they were motivated to, like,
They'd be blowing up their own business model, and they'd lose their readership and be known as the fake Snopes that would probably give them about a year of credibility, and then boom, right? That wouldn't last very long. Now that I'm out of the business, I can say more freely, I have long questioned the relationship between news and advertising anyway. I went to the New York Times because they were building a subscription business. I worked at Forbes, and Forbes was online. And online news, at least in the Forbes world, was like this snake that ate its tail. Because you put out stories, and you get ads, and that's more pages, and supply and demand dictates that you've now got more supply and a finite demand, so the price of each ad goes down, so you put out more pages, and you hire 900 guys who have no vetting whatsoever to put out stuff, and you get more ads, but you're driving the price down, like you're corroding your brand, so the price goes down. I really like subscriptions. I think people should pay for people doing hard work of determining what is true. I think that relationship, as I said, had to do with the newspapers controlling time and space. That went away. They really do need to search for a better business model. Yes?
So earlier in the talk, you mentioned different types of customization and like customized Google searches and other
Right.
ways that big data are learning more about you.
Right.
What are your thoughts on the privacy implications of models like that for the internet?
Well, to begin with, I think privacy is one of the most elusive things around. I mean, society is continually redefining what is public and what is private. And when you're in a new area like this, where everyone's a publisher and sort of likes displaying themselves, it becomes increasingly more difficult to say what is private, because some people want it public and some don't. Or for that matter, there is it was early days of the internet where some guys stopped people on the street in London and said, here's a Mars bar. I'll give you this Mars bar if you'll give me your national identification number, which is like their social security number, 30%. People don't value their privacy very well. That actually, if you want to talk about a new kind of literacy, the literacy of privacy would be a very valuable thing. Now, am I addressing your question?
I think so.
Okay,
Thank you.
next.
Can you talk about differences in kind of qualitative differences, either in terms of content or in terms of kind of spread patterns of fake news that spread for political purposes versus financial purposes versus, I guess, for lack of a better word, trolling purposes? Like, are they different in any kind of significant way?
I think that has more to do with the sophistication of the people doing the targeting, who are in that tradition of the direct marketer. They learn to target the optimal region they're going for. And the Russians or their proxies in the political states were looking for straddle states or straddle voters that they could push over and make stay home or vote for a candidate. The financial guys will target the Nevada cities of the internet where there are weaker, vulnerable people. And unfortunately, you can buy or figure out the access to those types. So I think in a sophisticated organization, it's a question of targeting. Now, is the vectors of like Twitter versus Facebook versus Reddit, I'm really not your guy.
Hi, my question is somewhat related to the previous question, and that is, do you think the sort of false dichotomy between fake news and real news contributes to the problem? And how can we bring more?
No, what's the false dichotomy? Fake news is
No,
fake.
but I mean, there's fake news, there's clickbait,
Yeah.
there is biased news that's still pretty well researched.
God, you sound like you're in the business.
There are a lot of different things. And part of that literacy I think we need is introducing that nuance.
Yes.
Because if we label things in a binary way, like, well, everything on the New York Times is true, so I'll trust anything they publish,
Except
or
the style
everything on another site is completely false.
Yes.
We're losing that literacy, really.
Just kidding about the style section.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And so I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on how to increase that nuance and maybe to create different types of categories and different ways of reading those differences.
Let me paraphrase that well-known technologist Mahatma Gandhi. People want the future so perfect they won't have to be good. You know? Like, basically, that's kind of up to us, right? But flippancy aside, we do need internal discipline. Like, this is, People magazine was a guilty pleasure, right? But Obama is not a US citizen is not a guilty pleasure. It is corrosive, right? And there is a difference. And we need to bear that in mind as consumers in a democracy.
So I've been in the education business for a long time, as have many people here. And I look at what's happening, and I have the feeling that we've failed. Have we failed? Or what can we do?
Have we failed? Look, we look at beautiful, beautiful pictures of Saturn as Cassini crashes into it. We recombine genomic information to cure childhood diseases. You're a victim of that information overload. There's some bad shit going on. It's also pretty good, too. Is democracy a bad idea? Is it not working out? Is that where you're going?
No, where I'm going is it seems like we have a lot of people who are exposed to some extent with education, and yet they haven't really thought things through. They haven't thought carefully about stuff.
I think, I sympathize with your point enormously. And I said at the beginning, one of the things Snow didn't note in the two cultures was the bias toward anti-intellectualism, of distrusting experts. Look at any scientific controversy, global warming being exhibit A, but there are many others. And yeah, we're not good about teaching scientific rigor. We're not good. As a culture, America has never been particularly terrific about valuing education and knowledge for its own sake. And that is corrosive to democracy, yes. Have we failed? We have so much access to information like never before. We have means to truth, and if we have failed, what's making your question painful for me is you're saying, we have failed, cue the recessional, instead of, we have failed, let's do a better job. You know what I mean?
Well,
that's the way it feels in your voice.
I think we've done wonderful things. We've detected gravity waves.
Right.
And we've looked back to the start, perhaps, of the universe.
Right.
We understand, perhaps, how life evolved. Mm-hmm. And it seems like there are a lot of people in our civilization who have no appreciation. They've taken away from these examples no knowledge and no critical thinking.
Well, there's also some kid in Madagascar who's got a Nokia phone and is accessing that. You know, have some perspective. The promulgation of educated people across the planet is unheard of historically. And we may be heading, I mean, I mentioned Luther and the Reformation and that technology change. The downside was the wars of the Reformation wiped out a third of Germany. But it was also the beginning of a civilizational reset. And let's hope we don't have the death of the third of Germany issue, but there is a certain kind of shared global sensibility that in many ways is quite positive. I mean, just look at warfare in a way, at least from in the West. You know, when my father was at life, they all became anti-war by about 1969. And as a somewhat of an anti-war statement, they published the photographs, you may remember this, the photographs of 1 week's dead US citizens in Vietnam who had been killed that week. And it was mostly boys 18 to 25, biased toward 18, 260 guys. You imagine 260 Americans being killed in warfare now, what that would be like? Like the value given to an individual soldier's life now is so much higher because we sort of witness and experience this stuff up close. It's the positive side of getting this information thrown at us. So I think this society has its problems, but on balance, you can also see a lot of positive developments around it.
Okay, I didn't mean to sound so gloomy.
No, but, you know, have we created some problems for ourselves? Oh, you bet, you know. Should we get to work and try and fix them? I think so. You know, I don't want to go back.
How?
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 Parents, make your children do their homework. Respect your teachers. Learn facts, they're worth it. Eat dinner together, yeah. Converse. Yeah, put down the phone when they're at the playground and watch them. It's you too, you know. There's some pretty simple hygiene there. It aggregates pretty well. Another question.
Thank you.
Hey, so this is Dave Mosher with Business Insider.
Oh, you're a ringer. Okay.
Yeah. Well, no, this is not a ringer question.
Okay.
Since you asked a question during our panel, I felt it was only appropriate.
It's a nice way of saying I'm getting back. Go ahead.
No, so you said you were also open to questions about Google, and you,
sure.
And it's a good segue just now. You know, what are we going to do about it? I admit I don't quite fully understand what your position is within the organization, what you know, what kind of information you have access to, in decision making in that regard. But you know, I think back to moments during the campaign where Google results were aiding in the spread of false information.
Yeah.
And what I'm getting at in regards to this fake news topic is, what is Google doing about it? Because they're one of the most powerful companies in the entire world.
I think they are.
And I'm kind of curious.
Yeah.
What is Google doing right now about this issue? What is it, especially in anticipation of the 2018 midterms? Like, what's going on there? What solutions are being talked about or being implemented? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'll cut to the bottom line. I don't know, but then I'll talk because why not? I work at Google Cloud, which is my work is the editorial side on that. I said at the beginning, there is this kind of technology of a new fundamental civilization having to do with information, large amounts of computing in two-way communication at every point on the planet. We'll call it cloud. That's what I write about. Like, that is my beat, in a sense. I try to explain that in as many contexts as I can because it's such a rich patch. I used to do it at the New York Times. I decided to do it from inside a company. They had an interest in someone just delivering analytic information to people. And I have published, and when I publish now, I say in the third paragraph, I work for Google. You know, implicitly, if you want to stop reading and thinking I'm biased, fine, I've annotated myself, right? If you want to keep reading and think I've got a point of view, you know who I am. And so far, that seemed to work out okay. Now, to circle back, what you're talking about is Google on the consumer side, and I'm really not part of that. However, I am aware, they are aware of the nature of information flows and this attribution problem and this velocity problem. And there's a lot of learning that is taking place, you know, and I do think that will, and for God's sakes, don't put me down as a Google spokesman on this, because I know about as much as you do. I can see you typing, like you're gonna quote me, and I don't know anything. That would be fake news. To present me as a Google person who knew anything about this would be fake news. Okay, are we clear? Thank you. I know you're tempted because it'll get some clicks, but don't do it. I have said very clearly, I know nothing. Did I say I was clear? I know nothing. He knows nothing. Can I hear that? He knows nothing. Thank you. Do not make a story from it. Next.
My question is about accountability. You spoke earlier about Facebook knowing, selling their ad space to Russia, and I know in the tech world they're like, oh, we didn't realize that people were actually buying this stuff. But when they realized it was having a significant impact on the divisiveness of the two groups that they were focusing on, and then ultimately, affecting the outcome of our, our people say, affected the outcome of our election. What accountability do they have as far as the people hosting this stuff and accepting money in order to take these ads that they can see that are affecting, such consequential outcomes as our election? Like, is that on the person that makes the news, or is that on the people that host and propagate the news? They know or
I think you do have to take them at a certain amount of good faith, and they didn't know what this outcome was, and so it's one of these fool me once deals, right? If they didn't change their habits and practices, you'd have a lot more reason to be angry than you can right now.
And how
everybody's learning this as they go, right?
How do we keep that from moving forward? We say, okay, now we're angry. We want this to stop. How do we get these large distributors to stop propagating these harmful and corrosive stories? How do we get that at this point? I mean, we have people that are counting on these things, much like our current administration. They're kind of counting on these things going forward. They seem to, when he makes a tweet on, attacking North Korea, and then everybody pops on it, and then, I start seeing things on my news feed, that pop up that kind of feed the fake news stories that kind of feed, and so.
Well, it's not always fake either. The real problem is like the sort of shadow news around that, umbral news.
Yeah, how do we keep that from, now that
which is just bad reporting in many ways.
Now that we've seen it, the fake news, how do we keep that, how do we put measures in place that say, okay, aside from like the local level of, teaching your children to, to research what they read, but how do we make these people accountable for spreading such, divisive or corrosive stories that have no basis in fact?
If it were to continue, I would be very, very surprised if lawmakers didn't haul them forth. And that's typically what happens in a democracy, right? You complain to your congressman enough, and
we hope so.
Yeah, that's sort of typically how it goes, and I don't think this path would be that different.
I had a recent representative in Indiana, and a constituent sent them a care package, and it was candy that they had written, I think it was Sour Patch Kids, and they had written, candy, or kids are sweet, but forced births are leave a sour taste, and it was like a thing for.
That's bizarre.
Yeah, it was. It was for not getting rid of their. Planned Parenthood, basically. It was, right. And I can see, and it was trying to get his attention and, to get him to pay attention to stuff. But what he rather did was take the letter that the constituent with their names visible and the candy and the pear packet and said, look how soulless and, irreprehensible my constituents have done. Basically.
That's even more bizarre.
Yeah, trying to bait, you could
Well,
tell
and he
he was
doxed them,
baiting his.
as they say. He revealed their
yes,
identity to the
doxing.
world maliciously so that some troll or malefactor could start making their life
And
hell.
I saw a news.
And that's
And news stories
totally
picked this
reprehensible.
up. They picked this up, and rather than focusing on the fact that he is doxing his constituents, they focus on the fact that they sent him candy. And how dare they? And it completely turned towards kind of a spin piece for his agenda, as opposed to the fact that, hey, he's publishing names of constituents. I mean, is that considered?
Are you asking me whether the world is
No.
stupid? Because
Yeah.
yeah.
Or, is that
I'm getting off the stage now. This is
Yeah.
hard.
I'm sorry. As far as legality, I mean, and the idea of public information, when you send a letter to your representative, do you expect that that is public knowledge that they can post on social media to kind of shame you, or?
I circle back to Mahatma Gandhi. Do I expect people to behave better than that? Yeah.
Okay.
Does his mama know he's doing that?
I hope so.
Golly, that's where I come. It's-
Yeah. My surprise was the fact that people were not outraged at his actions; they were outraged at the candy. It was like, where?
In the online world, you forget the other person is a human being really quickly, and you just get all id, and you start flaming this way and feeling temporarily powerful. You would never talk to somebody to their face this way.
Yeah, FaceTime.
There you go.
Yeah,
Last
Apple.
question. Are we sort of like hitting the clock? Last question.
Okay, so, hi.
Hey.
So you talked a little bit about automating attribution algorithms and whatnot as a request to highlight what's
Yeah, a
probably
deeper
pretty
kind of
obviously-
literacy. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty obviously things that are fake news. But you also touched on the Russian influence on our election as well as other elections. And this brings up a thornier problem of propaganda and psychological operations in general.
Yes.
And so across that, my understanding is that they generally have three categories. There's black propaganda, which is your fake news.
Yeah.
They have white propaganda, which is basically no one disagrees with the truth behind that.
Right.
And there's gray propaganda, which actually is mostly true. And in fact, a lot of it's actually contextual as far as who you're targeting it.
Yeah, it's selective though.
Yes, so
And it's usually fear-inducing.
not necessarily, but yeah, again, like you were saying before, a lot of things play upon our anxieties. But the real question here is when you have state actors that come into this, what do you declare or what would you draw the line at as an actual act of war? Knowing that there
my
are
God.
nonviolent options,
Yeah.
like for instance, no, this
No,
is a serious
it's a
question.
very deep question.
This is a serious question.
No, the oh my God was like, you've asked the $64,000 question. These people are messing with our heads vis-a-vis being a democracy. I'm kind of offended, and I do think it is an act of psychological warfare, but the rules of war tend to be around violence and not around speech.
But there are other forms of war that we recognize, like for instance blockades, which are not necessarily nonviolent, but are
Yeah.
universally recognized as an act of war. I remember I used to work for a DoD contractor, and we were presented with some problems on informational trust. And I remember having almost exactly the same discussion probably over 10 years ago on
Yeah.
where an open society draws the line
Yeah.
between when you have state actors that come in to try and influence your internal politics.
It's terribly ironic that you remember sort of 12 so years ago, we talked about soft power. This was like the big American thing. We were going to influence the mindset.
Right.
And there was this soft power of democracy and our way of life. And I mean, you could even go further back to when communism fell and free market democracy had clearly won and, join us in this thing. The authoritarian state is winning the soft power war, with what they're doing. This is soft power being totally abused and weaponized. And what should we do about that?
Yeah, and again, I
The cleansing
agree that-
rays of sunlight are
No.
expose their networks and their methods, and you discredit them and you weaken them. Now, what do you do punitively on them? You tell them not to mess with you, or you won't trade with them. You probably standard forms of escalation around other means of communication and transport of goods.
Do you personally recognize that what they've done as a form of aggression, though? Not necessarily an act of war, let's say, but as a form of aggression?
Oh, God.
Not to put you on the spot or
No,
anything, but you are
it's-
actually in the
it's
spotlight.
It's a really interesting question. You know, is it aggressive to try and distort the workings of a functional state to make it dysfunctional? I think that question answers itself.
Dysfunctional or just more agreeable?
No, to corrode a system of democracy so that it is dysfunctional, which is the long game in this kind of thing.
Okay, so you would say that it is an act of aggression. Not necessarily an act of war, but an act of aggression.
Yeah, I would say, you know, messing with the systems of information and creating mental chaos is it's the act of a propaganda department against a state with which you are competing, you know, often in proxy wars elsewhere, you know, by allying one against it. We have a long history of proxy competition, and they're hijacking our systems of information.
To be fair about this, we do the same thing with other countries too. Like Radio Free Europe, for instance, was us basically broadcasting propaganda across the wall, was it not?
This is like a whole other talk. Yes,
Yeah, sure, yeah.
You know, yes, we have done it too. Have we aggressively undermined elections? Yes, I heard it in the room. It's true. You know, does that make it okay to do to us and like at large throughout this new technology? No, you know. So there's that.
I'm good. Thank you for your thoughts.
That sounds like an end. Okay. Thank you.